Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Taylor Pinen. I'm actually redoing the recording for the first part of this because we forgot to press record, of course. Woohoo. Um, so there is going to be a little transition after a few slides back to the real day. Um, but yeah, so to get us started off, my thesis is called White Settler Colonial Dissonance, Resisting Moves Towards Innocence. I wanted to just thank my committee members. So my chair, Matthew Herman, he is in Native American Studies here at MSU. Thank you so much for the time that you took to really be with me through the ups and downs of this project, of my time in this program, and to read all the drafts that I would give at very sporadic times. Thank you, Francine Spang Willis, amazing woman and oral historian. Such a gift to have her on my committee. Encouraging you all to look into her work. Just an amazing oral historian. Eric Bennett. I took classes through the Native American Studies program at Central Wyoming College. Eric was the professor that I took the most classes with, and we got to have so much one-on-one time. It was truly such a gift to, yeah, have someone to talk about just Wind River and the area, the ongoing history with. Christine Stanton, we met last year, and alongside Matt Herman and Francine, we all three of us met last year. And Christine, when we met, I kind of just immediately knew that we'd be pretty close because she she's worked or she's lived and worked in Iowa City, which is where I grew up, and in Lander. So I know that we have very similar life experiences and life goals. So it's just been really great to talk and learn from her. Really wanting to uplift all four of my committee members. Thank you all so much. So in Western academia, there, especially in a thesis or a dissertation, there's usually just one author, one researcher that gets their name. Um, that's incomplete. There's a lot to unpack there, but this project, I am here trying to get a master's degree, but this project and my time in this department could not have been done without the people that you see in front of you, and then so many more who aren't pictured. This is my family. Uh, my family, my community. Family means people that keep me grounded, that keep me whole, and also people that I'm in a lot of tension with and don't really always know how to get through it. But so much learning has been done with this family that I'm just truly so in awe and so grateful of every single person here. Um, and all the new family that I still have yet to meet. I specifically wanted to uplift Meadow. I'm circling around his image right now. Meadow and baby Maher. He is someone who I sponsor in Gaza. We've been in communication for over a year now. We're in daily communication. Um, and yeah, as someone who is living under occupation, um, it's just meant a lot to be in contact with him, to learn from him, to be in friendship with him. And I wanted to uplift um, his donation link that I'll put in the chat. Everything helps. Um, so if you can donate, that would be truly amazing and a gift. So before we get into the project itself, I've got a few groundings that I wanted to get through and some notes that I wanted to talk about. So a lot of what I'm about to share is going to be more apparent in the written form of the project, but also just right now as I'm talking, specific language is going to be used that I think will be helpful to talk about and define up front. So this project is about white settlers. So settler, I'm not talking about immigrants, about a group of people that come to a place and conform to an already established system. That's not what settlers do. We impose our own system through violence. Not settlers are not indigenous. They're not indigenous to the lands. They cannot become indigenous, especially through violent erasure. Our ancestral ties, even if we have 6 generations, that's nothing. In the grand scheme of things, our ancestral ties are not deep to this land. I'll be specifically talking about this land that we now call the United States. And then also, settlers are not displaced or stolen, specifically Black people and Black descendants of enslaved people from African countries. Settlers, that's not our history. Also, whiteness, white people. So in this project, I use a hybrid capitalization of white and whiteness. So a lowercase w in white recognizes a political and racial formation of white. So it's a concept, it's an idea, and therefore it can be an idea that can be divested from, rejected, but very much a real thing. And then an uppercase version of white, or the uppercase W, recognizes the cultural formation of whiteness. For me, how I understand a shared culture of whiteness is a shared culture of power and privilege and domination. So not necessarily a good thing, but it's still a shared culture and a shared lens through how we view the world. So yeah, this project is about white settlers. I'm not talking about non-white settlers, so people of color who come through a settler identity to new lands. That's not my lived experience, so I'm not talking about that. But there's so much scholarship from non-white settlers. In the project, I think it's really important that every scholar that is referenced, that I understand that their scholarship is non-neutral and their identity in creating their scholarship is not neutral. So in Western academia, it's predominantly white settlers who are producers of knowledge within Western academia and of data and of like published papers. And it's often not even recognized that white settlers are the primary authors. So it's really important that I take time to recognize authors' position to land and empire. So I'll say, especially in the written portion of the project, I'll just have parentheses, like a name, parentheses, white settler. And that's usually done through like some internet sleuthing. A lot of people are starting to get into the habit of writing in like a bio that they're a settler, or if it's a Black scholar or indigenous person, I'll say they're like tribal nation. So I'm not just like guessing. I'll put maybe relationship unknown if I don't know, because I do recognize there is a danger of just like creating labels, human-made labels, and placing them onto people in strict ways. That's the whole history of eugenics. I'm not trying to do that with this practice, but it's recognizing the importance of naming the non-neutrality of scholarship and identities of scholars. So also in the project, I use a lot of us and we statements. So this is a recognition that I, as a single white settler, cannot distance myself from the harm of white settler colonization. So yeah, there's often like the desire to be like the good white person. And I'm not trying to do that. Like, I see harm that that I or my white peers do is a part of a bigger system, and we need to see ourselves within that system and hold each other accountable. Lastly, this is also in the written form of the project. I do lowercase colonial nations, so that we can delegitimize these colonial nations. So the United States is lowercase, Israel lowercase, Canada, blah blah blah. Not blah blah blah, but to truly recognize that resistance happens in every form, and written statements are resistance, and language can be resistance, and language can be a reinforcer as well if we're not careful with it. So some further groundings. In honesty, I've invited a lot of people to this presentation, people I call my family, people I call my community, and we have pretty differing views. So I'm not sure how these ideas are going to land with everyone. And that's that. We might not agree. Um, but I do believe that as a collective, we have a duty to engage with each other. And we can build some communal skills to get through defensiveness that we might feel if we don't agree. The overall goal of this project is collective healing, collective liberation. And I'm constantly experimenting on what that even looks like. I'm constantly messing up. Um, so I'm just wanting to name that up front, that especially for white settler people in the audience, there might be some feelings of defensiveness. Um, and that also, this project is going to be heavy. I don't want to gloss over realities of ongoing colonial violence, of white supremacy, um, that isn't for shock and spectacle. Um, it's more that we can't forget and we can't stop recognizing that this violence is ongoing. So do what you need to get through. I like to tell my students, I'm a TA for Intro to Native American Studies, like, you have agency. I want to uplift and empower individual coping skills and coping methods so that people can get through things, so that we can take in information that makes us feel uncomfortable. So for my white settler audience in particular, do what you need to get through, but get through it. It might, you might feel like you want to leave, just to feel comfortable. So ask yourself, what feelings are coming up. Really interrogate where those feelings might be coming from. And then also you might be like, oh, I need to fix this, or I want to do something about this right away. That is a tendency of urgency thinking, and sit with that too. But also, because I will be naming history, and ongoing history, again, not for shock and spectacle, this also is not about to position Black and Indigenous communities specifically, or other marginalized communities into a deficit framing, which is very common in academia. Really, this is about white people making ourselves look inward. So also, just wanting to name some contradictions in this, I have grappled with the fact that I am trying to get a master's degree in a predominantly white institution that, continues to uphold colonialism. And a master's makes it sound like I'm an expert when that is in no way the case. I will not have arrived to some level of legitimacy once I'm done with this program. So I want to be clear about that. Again, as I'm clear as my name is on this for authorship, that's incomplete. And I'll always be incomplete in knowing and in learning. And that's not a bad thing. Also, let's put questions at the end, but I do encourage you to journal and write throughout. this process. For people in the audience, I have some journaling questions that I encourage you to look at. I will be using humor, some social media posts, or art to convey ideas. I think this helps make ideas, especially difficult ideas and topics, a little more accessible. Some language that we can all interpret. And then also, we're not going to get through it all, and I hate that, but that's the reality of this. We don't have much time together, and I wish we could truly go through every chapter, but we're not going to be able to. So in Indigenous research, it is common to have a positionality statement. This statement is really about recognizing where a scholar comes from. And I love this practice because it's about taking a breath in knowing that we have biases, we have flaws, we have lived experiences, and that those aren't inherently bad things. They just shape the lens through how we view the world. And naming those up front opens up the necessity to have multiple researchers of different backgrounds, which is really exciting. But also a positionality statement. What I've done so far, I've talked a little bit about the other people who I would consider authors who have informed me throughout this project. But the land has also really informed how I think of this world, especially the questions that I feel and the contradictions that I feel and the tension that I feel. The land, the context that comes from the land has informed all of that. So I wanted to uplift the Restoring Shoshone Ancestral Food Gathering group, which is a food sovereignty group on the Wind River Reservation, because they have a academic journal article that they published a few years ago. And something that you might skip over at first glance, but is so monumental, is that they put Shoshone ancestral land as their first author on this academic journal. And that's huge. That really recognizes the humility of humans, and the importance of land. So I find it really important that I think of how the land has shaped this project. So there are 4 places that I've called home during these past 2 years while I've been in this program at MSU. So the first is this top left picture. That's Bozeman. It's my favorite running trail right in town. I love running for how it allows me to calm my brain and rethink about all the chaos that's around me. And then I go home and I go to my apartment on campus housing and I feel calm. And then I'm reminded that just a half-mile away, there's a weapons manufacturing company that is supported by the university that makes mass surveillance technology to send to the Israeli army. This top right picture is right outside of Tucson, Arizona, where I go in the summers to work with a group that supports migrants crossing the border in the desert heat. And Tucson is a space of cognitive dissonance. In so many ways, Tucson's so fun. The journal entry that was at the beginning of this presentation, that was me after swimming at the University of Arizona pool, remembering that just a little drive away, there's a human-made border, and that there's an Air Force base that constantly has their fighter jet drills overhead. And in so many ways, Tucson is a war zone, but people can forget that. The bottom left picture is my favorite place on earth, Sinks Canyon in Lander in Wyoming. So Sinks Canyon is a place of a lot of recreationalists, mostly white settlers. I go here to run, I go here to climb, to hike, to camp. I love it. but it's not lost on me every time I do it that there's a long history of Lander as a man camp, as a border town to the Wind River Reservation that is a site of ongoing violence. That this land is stolen and is continued to be exploited and taken by white settlers, and right now in the name of recreation. The bottom right is my full grounding. It's home in Iowa. That's where I grew up. That's where, I mean, all these places, it's where my family is, but my Iowa family is what made me become a human. Um, that is a reservoir by my house in Iowa City. And Iowa has always been a pretty hard place for me. I've always had a lot of tension living in Iowa and understanding what family means. But I love Iowa so much. There's a calmness about Iowa that makes me feel whole, especially at the reservoir. But right now, I'm thinking about in Cedar Rapids, where I went to high school, there's 150 weapons manufacturing contracts and multiple weapons manufacturing industries that my friends and family work at. And it's everywhere you go. You're reminded that the militarization has been normalized. And I cannot be passive to that. So those places have informed some questions and some tensions that I've been having about this world that we live in, this colonial world that we live in. And specifically Lander, I lived there for over 3 years before moving to Montana to do this program. And Lander's one of the best places. I live in the best home, Wind River Pride headquarters. So this picture, you'll see Ten and Alex showing the juxtaposition of emotions that we feel when June Pride ends. It's great. But Lander is, as I mentioned, is a border town, a majority white settler border town to the reservation. The reservation is home to the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribal nations. And then it's also right next to Riverton, about 30 minutes away. Riverton, though it's located within the boundaries of the reservation, it's a border town because it was ceded, or I would say stolen, in 2017, which we'll talk about a little later. So it's in this home that I've been able to form some specific questions. I originally wanted to go back to school because within this community, we were trying to really engage and recognize that as a multiracial group, we all had different roles within the group of how to go about collective healing. And we recognize that as we're a queer group, our healing really centers on collective liberation. So the liberation specifically of Indigenous peoples and the lands is something that grounds us as the liberation of all people. So I wanted to go back to school to think about what are white people's specific role in a movement towards Indigenous liberation, and specifically the land back movement. I was wanting to learn more about land tenure and the very colonial system of land tenure, and how white people can go about actively giving back land, still within this colonial framework, but yeah, lots of steps to actively sell land back to tribal nations, which I won't go super deep into, but I really appreciated. I did I was a research assistant learning about this, and appreciated my time learning, but I was just recognizing that I was a few steps ahead in what I actually should have been looking at. Most of my white peers, family, we don't, well, one, we hardly recognize ourselves as white, but we especially don't recognize ourselves as a settler. So the idea of selling back land or even giving back land is a foreign concept that doesn't make sense. And we don't, because we don't even think of ourselves as settlers, we don't even think of why our liberation is tied to returning land back to ancestral caretakers. So I was recognizing that the importance of taking those steps back and trying to address, how I can get and how I personally can think of my own healing within this bigger movement towards healing of this was hard because it was also happening around the same time that in Wind River Pride we were also having tension. Most groups have tension, and we've really tried to address tension and recognize how race and colonialism creates tension within our group. But we're not perfect. And I was noticing that myself and other white peers did some things that, it's a euphemism, that upheld colonialism, that upheld racism. Maybe they were in the form of microaggressions, or we also saw a lot of macroaggressions happening within the town of Lander as a whole. And this violence was often justified within our own individual minds, but also within our own collective minds. So I invited my friends over to talk about a research question and kind of brought this up. I called it the whack shit, for lack of a better term, a more conversational term, but it was to recognize that we were doing some weird things to make ourselves feel better while violence was continuing on at the expense of specifically our Black and Indigenous community members. So I read this essay by Osage thinker Tink Tinker, who asked Native American studies and just the broader movement of Indigenous liberation and sovereignty. What are we going to do with white people? And I feel like I've been asking that question a lot. What are we going to do with ourselves? And I've been seeing that, yeah, we've got a lot to do. And that we've got a lot to do to look inwards while also engaging in broader community building. But so that we even recognize that we're still causing harm, and that we're causing harm and then justifying that harm. So that kind of started the foundation of this research project. And also, I wanted to keep the 4 Rs very close to me as I formed an actual question. So the 4 Rs of Indigenous research have now gone up to like maybe 8 Rs. I don't know, there's a lot, but the 4 original Rs are respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. Relevance and responsibility felt really important to me as a white researcher in a Native American studies program, really not in this program to go with the more anthropology track of like researching Indigenous communities. That's not what I'm interested in. I see a lot of harm that is done. I'm here to look at myself and to look at my other white peers and to bring my other white peers into this. So in a way that's relevant to us, that we see ourselves in the need to heal, and that we have a responsibility to each other as white peers and to the broader collective in this overall movement. Okay, so this brought us to 2 research questions. So I didn't really know much about cognitive dissonance before coming into this project, but I wanted to learn about it, to talk about it. So I was like, what are the things that white people do to make ourselves feel better, to alleviate cognitive dissonance when we commit violence or when we see or witness violence, specifically in a colonial context? So this could be, again, microaggressions or something really big. And then how does that practice or those habits, how does that like continue this cycle of violence. I learned that there is a scholar, a Cree scholar, Shailene Wutini-Jobin, who in one little chapter of her book, which I have over on the table, Upholding Indigenous Economic Relationships, she talks about colonial dissonance. And this is an idea that, based off of cognitive dissonance, which is like a Western concept from Leon Festinger. Colonial dissonance is when Indigenous people can't live in accordance with Indigenous values because of the need to survive in colonization. That's what we're talking about, but I'm talking about it with white people. That white people, we supposedly, hopefully, for a lot of us, we do want to be quote unquote good people or live with values, but we keep doing these things that cause harm, that are violent. So white settler colonial dissonance is the term that I've come to see is what's going to hold this project. It's a very jargony term, but it's just specifically the things that white people do that cause harm, that go against our belief. So throughout the project, I had decided to center the project on Wyoming. Wyoming, Lander specifically, is a border town to the Wind River Indian Reservation, home of the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho tribal nations. And a border town, that's a physical town next to a sovereign nation. A lot of times we don't think of border towns as anything except like towns next to Canada or Mexico, because we often don't think of tribal nations as sovereign. But border towns are also just conceptions. They're ideas. Anywhere in the US is a border town. Anywhere where colonial order meets indigenous order is a border, is a site of contradiction. So also the things that white settlers do to make ourselves feel better, a lot of these practices make ourselves innocent. So there's a pretty seminal essay called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor by Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang. And this essay essentially says that white people, we do this weird stuff. That's a euphemism. And we make ourselves innocent in the process, and we must actively destroy that. That is a very unsettling act. That's not just some concept, some idea, but we all have a stake in it. So collective liberation, bridging queer, Black, and Indigenous feminism, recognizing that structures impact us all, and we all have a role in dismantling these structures. So those are the theories that kind of ground this whole project. Each chapter has like specific theories to explain stuff, but those four are the main theories. The thesis is split up into a few chapters to talk about these questions. I realized pretty quickly on that context matters when talking about white settler colonial dissonance. So the first two chapters are just kind of building that context up. So the first two chapters are about the history and the formation of Wind River country as we know it today. They're very legal heavy, so we're not going to dive super into the legality, but if anyone wants to talk afterwards about it, it's pretty dense, and I would love to talk about it because it's all made up. Also feels kind of like a euphemism, but yeah, they didn't need to be the way that they ended. And then I have a chapter about psychological framing, and then an oral history chapter with people directly from Wind River, one Native, Eastern Shoshone, and one white settler, to bring this all together. So I thought that doing this project in Wyoming was a great way to just be a microcosm for everywhere. So wherever you guys grew up, I hope that you can start thinking about how your own town might be different or might be similar to this context. Also, just wanted to quickly name some affirmations and commitments in this project before we really get into the weeds. This is essentially, I'm doing a very slow project with white people trying to bring white people in. And we are notorious for being slow or just acting off of urgency and doing it very harmfully. Um, and I just want to uplift all rights of resistance from people who are being occupied, who are being oppressed. Um, they're not on our timeline. They're not on our timeline. So whether that's resistance in Palestine or resistance here in what we call the United States, wanting to affirm that. And I think it's really important in academic settings that we affirm that. Also, this is not a project for white people to just try to like heal our minds and feel better. It's like when men go to therapy to make themselves feel better, but not dismantle the patriarchy. We're not trying to replicate that. And we're also not trying to wallow in guilt either. This is about actively committing to the work. And then we're going to mess up. This is going to be messy. And I'm not trying to be competitive with anyone. I think in academia, there's a lot of like incentives to distinguish ourselves. I don't like that. The faults of myself are accountable to other people. The faults of my peers, I'm accountable to, and I want to name that. So that brings us to the first two chapters after the introduction, so chapter 2 and 3, that give the context. We're going to kind of breeze through these, hate that, but truly they're not like the project themselves. They just give context for how the history of colonization has shaped white settler minds to become essentially henchmen of empire. That's a very loaded term. Don't know how that's going to land. Moving on. I ground both of these chapters into real life stories. Autoethnography is one of the methods that I use. So this first story is of a white supremacist neo-Nazi group showing up to one of our Pride drag shows a few years ago. This kind of struck us to our core as a community, not just because of the overt violence that demonstrated that like overt in your face colonial violence is still very prevalent, but also because as a group, we did not handle it well. We kind of turned on each other, white people becoming kind of de facto cops at a Pride event that we said, no cops. That really was a wake-up call that we have a lot to do. So that story is meant to start out this chapter in saying that these habits are still learned, they're still in our bodies. So for this chapter, this chapter is pretty blunt and could be hard, so I do want to name that. One of the theories and frameworks for this chapter is recognizing rape as a tool and metaphor for colonization, as a very physical tool of colonization, but also just a practice of colonization that has inextricably caused a wound in Native communities that has lasted generations. And this isn't just a rape of people, but also a rape of land and water. So as this project gives context for the formation of Wind River Country, the first treaty of 1863 was for Shoshone people, 44 million acres. The second treaty, just a few years later, brought that down to 3.3 million acres. And then the past 100 years or so, with one of the most recent cases in 2017, which we'll talk about, has shrunk the reservation down to 2.2 million acres. That's traumatic. That is a complete decimation. Indigenous people, Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho in particular, who still live in the area, are still fighting, still here. So I don't want to create a false illusion of that, but we need to name the violence of that. And unfortunately, I'm just breezing through this, and that does not give this justice. But that being said, there were multiple tactics of genocide. Again, the more overt tactics to the more insidious tactics, such as placing the Northern Arapaho onto the reservation, where Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho were traditional enemies. The United States definitely knew that. And then also tactics of assimilation and cultural genocide, boarding schools, trying to decimate the buffalo. This is all manifested today in problems that are often just pushed aside as like problems in Native communities, away from a long history of settler colonialism that was inflicted and continues to be perpetrated by white settlers. So today this looks like missing and murdered Indigenous people, where white settlers are like the largest perpetrators of violence. That's often not even talked about. And then also, more insidiously, this looks like using the legal framework of American law and state law to continuously take land. That's the more, it's morphed, it's become a little bit more justified when it's in the legal realm. So I look at a recent case that ended in 2014. This is this, I would say, the stealing of water. So this is the Bighorn adjudication case, in which 2/3 of the water of the basin was legally granted for private stakeholders to be diverted from the reservation and mostly given to like cattle ranchers and that realm. And not only that, the Wyoming courts decided what the tribes could do with the remaining 1/3 of water. They said, oh, the treaty says that this area is supposed to be for agriculture. So tribes, you only get to use the water for agriculture, when both the Eastern Shoshone and Northern Arapaho have a water code that states about 14 different uses, from ceremonial to agriculture and everything in between, that they should be able to use. This shouldn't be the United States or the state of Wyoming placing our law and justification on, especially because they're sovereign nations. But that is what happened. So the case was about 37 years for the state of Wyoming to figure out how to get as much water as they could. And this looks today like environmental degradation. That is an old picture of Diversion Dam, which is right outside outside of Wharton, which is on the Wind River River. And the entire ecosystem has been changed because of this human-made diversion. There was a symposium about 10 years ago about the results of this case, where white people and Native community members came together to talk about next steps. And I wanted to uplift Sarah Robinson, who's Eastern Shoshone. She's a lawyer. I worked with her at the Wyoming Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. So when I was like doing this research and watching these 4-hour videos of this conference, I was like, oh my gosh, I know her. But ultimately, she said everything is being attacked, especially during that time. So this was a time of 2014, the case ended. In 2013, that brings us to chapter 3. 2013, another case started to steal a whole town through the legal system. So Riverton, Wyoming is right within the boundaries of the reservation. Lander is a little outside of the reservation. Riverton has existed as like a settler enclave, but only when the case was decided by 2017, it was officially transferred from tribal to state ownership through a very subjective legal reasoning, which I go into. But ultimately, it was just border town violence. It was just a modern day enactment of violence, but through legal jargon that is really inaccessible and really expensive. And this time period of legal cases did not exist within a vacuum. During the time, so violence was being perpetrated on multiple fronts, not just through the lawmakers, but police, through regular white settlers, social media, is a cesspool of racism, still is today. But also, 27 affidavits were sent by different stakeholders to the courts to talk about the potential consequences if the land was to be given to tribal jurisdiction. These were based in very racist and fear-mongering tropes about like, oh, if the tribes have the land, then the jail is just going to be spread open and everything's going to be dangerous and bad. So very playing into these justifications of fear and fear of a quote unquote other, because there's lots of division between people. So this area was emboldened during that time. And so the story that I share in this chapter, I just really want to honor Andy Antelope. He was murdered in 2019 by a Riverton police officer, James Donahue. James Donahue is still an active police officer. He lives in Shoshone now. Justice has never been served, but James Donahue took on a role as a U.S. Or Riverton police officer to enforce U.S. like justifications of violence. I imagine we all have differing views on the police, so we're not going to dive super deep into that, but I think it's really important that we just name the foundations of policing, specifically in a settler context. And also, the statistics speak for themselves. Andy is not a statistic, he's a human, but the statistics of the area do show a very gross overrepresentation of Native people in the prison system. So in Riverton alone, Native people are 16% of the population, but make up 77% of the arrests. That's staggering. And I try to name that in like literally every presentation I go, because we have to reconcile with that. So those two chapters, they really set the stage for this longer history of every avenue that settlers find ourselves in, whether we're acting in an official role or we're just everyday citizens. Every avenue has been designed to continuously strip Native relationships, whether that be between each other or with water and land. So this chapter brings us into hopefully a wake-up call that this chapter is about recognizing the harms that we continue to do, but also looking at the ways in which these systems of colonization have also harmed white people. I feel very nervous talking about this chapter because I think it's really easy for white people to center ourselves and take on like a victim mentality. But the intention of this chapter is to realize that we are active agents for the better and the worse, and we have a collective choice to do better. So I actually started as a psychology major in my undergrad. I hated it. It was just very like, my brain is messed up. And I'm like, yeah, but I'm pretty sure my brain's messed up because of like all this, not because my like something's not like firing in my brain or whatever. And I started to get really involved with different movements, mostly Black and Indigenous led movements that I didn't really know my role in, but I resonated a lot. So specifically the eating disorder harm reduction movement. This movement centers Black and Indigenous fat people, recognizing that a natural response to colonization is disordered eating. And I started to realize we all have disordered eating in this world, this society that we live in. We're so disconnected from our food. We're so disconnected from each other. And that really started to open up that all of these systems in the world have created the harms that I experienced as a child growing up. So whether that be domestic violence or alcoholism or whatever that my family has gone through, that I have an immense amount of love for my family, but also frustration that we haven't been able to connect some dots and talk about how we have trauma that lives on. Felt really frustrating. But I've started to see and to question now Western psychology often doesn't give us tools to think about these bigger systems. So I started to learn more about Black psychology and Indigenous psychology in particular, which recognizes the human as part of a bigger system. So whether that system be these human-made systems of settler colonialism and white supremacy, or within the bigger system of the universe, this cosmological system. I don't have deep ancestral ties to this land. I don't know really about my ancestral ties in Europe, where just a few generations my family came from. I don't know those people. I really can't even say outside of Finnish where I'm from. And that's a loss. And that most white people can't even name that loss is a symptom of colonization. And we haven't learned to even just say that out loud or grieve that loss. But Black and Indigenous psychology, though they're very distinct in their own ways and also very like place-based, broadly share a lot of overlaps about naming those dynamics. And really wanting to uplift the work of queer Black feminists and queer Indigenous feminists who often don't get the credit that's due in how they shaped these paradigms. So I just love these renditions of Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Audre Lorde, I feel, therefore I can be free. Bang at all land is, therefore we are. That's a whole reshaping. And that means a lot to me coming to learn these paradigms, but also how do I see myself as a white person in this? I'm not here to just take and extract and cherry pick tenets that are palatable to me. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a huge question that Western psychologists in particular, and then just people in general, as we are all facing immense mental health issues, need to be talking about, as many of our institutions are very westernized, which Western psychology has deep connections to the prison system, especially in the eating disorder world. Yeah, people are in crisis. Often that's a direct pipeline to prisons. But then also, again, being unable to talk about external forces at play. So something in talking about psychology that I really hope that we can continue having discussions on is creating a paradigm that is outside of this colonial Western paradigm, but that recognizes white people, white settlers, in this need to divest from systems that divide us, that keep us from even accessing parts of our brain to, like when we cause violence, that weird stuff that we do, we're not practiced in even addressing that. So I hope that continuously uplifting the work of Indigenous and Black scholars and activists and psychologists in particular, there's a humility in that, recognizing, wow, maybe what we think we have isn't it. So to kind of bring this back to the original two questions about cognitive dissonance and white settler colonial dissonance, have been interested in specifically finally naming these things that we do as white settlers to make ourselves feel better. So that goes back to Liam Festinger, who created the term cognitive dissonance, and he proposed 3 strategies that people do in general to alleviate cognitive dissonance. So this looks like you take an action, it goes against your values, you just change your values. This also looks like you take an action, you don't like it, you find a way to justify it, reasonings that align with the action you took. Or this looks like you take an action, you don't like it, but you say, oh, it wasn't a big deal. The consequences aren't that big. So using Black feminism and Black feminist psychology and Indigenous feminist psychology to put this into context with white settler colonial dissonance, to see these broader structures at play. For me, I did a literature review and saw that the themes that came out, a literature review specifically of like white settler actions, whether that specifically be about psychology or not. But these actions of violence, I kind of put them into these three categories and saw that for the first one, this looks like we just rely on othering people, distancing ourselves. That's the whole history of race, creating a separate category of person, a subhuman. That's still very baked into our minds, even if we don't use that language. The second one is just rewriting what we do as correct, and also within a very indigenous context, we have also started to rewrite ourselves as indigenous in a way that affirms our right to be on this land. And then also just diminishing the impacts. This often looks like just saying, oh, that was just what I did was a separate event. That doesn't have to do with white settler colonialism. So that brings us to the last chapter, which is bringing it back home. So stories of two Wyomingites who talk and have talked about white settler violence. So we came together. This was a very interesting process. I've never done something like this, having official storytelling in an academic setting. We won't have time to go directly into the process of IRB approval and all of that. It was a whole journey, but I couldn't have chosen two better people to do it with. My original intention was 16 people. I realized quickly that I did not have enough time to do that. Realistically, I did this in about 2 months. So 2 people was good. But yeah, these 2 women, Peonies and Lavender, that's their pseudonyms. They decided to remain anonymous, really wanting to uplift data sovereignty and autonomy. They get to choose what they get to do with the raw data, their interviews. But that being said, I wasn't quite sure how to even present their stories. I didn't ask them specifically about cognitive dissonance. I just wanted to hear their stories of living in Wyoming. But as I learned more about these 3 strategies, these 3 alleviation strategies, I realized that a lot of the stories fit pretty well within these strategies. So I learned about a framework approach, which essentially is this framework, this approach. Oh, this framework approach. Wow. Developed in Britain to essentially say that a group of researchers can have an idea, a theory ahead of time and see if the data matches that theory. That is a very top-down way of conducting and analyzing research, which I don't love, but there's already been a lot of work to go into cognitive dissonance that I'm just curious if they fit. And yeah, I don't believe in sticking things in strict categories. So I also realized that the stories overlap, the approaches or the strategies overlap. So the 3 categories, I kind of put all the stories into the 3 categories. I'm just going to give some snippets. So the first category, that relying on othering, Peonies is our Eastern Shoshone member. She talked a lot about the ways that she feels othered by people. So specifically in Riverton, being followed around stores, or feeling nervous for her daughter, who's also Eastern Shoshone. That feeling, those interactions that she's had with white people has not just manifested in the public stores in Riverton, but also with white cattle ranchers. So this leads us to our second alleviation strategy, the indigenization of settlers and rewriting settler narratives as right. a lot of cattle ranchers in Wyoming, a pretty common saying is like, "Oh, I'm fifth generation Wyoming," I and and that's kind of a pass for a lot of cattle ranchers to be able to say, I have authority over this land. You have to follow my laws, my ideas. So she shared a story of ooh, I wrote the wrong one. um, don't look at that. She shared a story essentially of the ways in which this one cattle rancher was trying to get um, all the buffalo, the tribal buffalo, to be branded like cattle. And because he's like, well, they're gonna just escape and come onto my property, and I'm not gonna know who they are, and it was just like, what? Lots to unpack there, but essentially he was just trying to prescribe prescribe this idea, this right idea, onto an indigenous community, the tribal nations, and how they manage their buffalo. And he was saying language of like, I've been here for generations, like I know how to do this. So putting it into that category. And then Lavender, who is our white settler, she talked a lot about the the ways of the ways in which people in Lander, in particular, throughout the history of Lander, have been told to create or cause violence and be the committers of violence, and that hasn't changed. And it's all within the notion of protection, of defense, that it is right to defend property, to defend white people. So there's a long history of that in Lander, but also she shared a story of last summer when 90 FBI agents in their SUVs came to Fort Washakie, very small town on the reservation, to do essentially a drug bust of like 3 people. A huge display of power, a huge display of this is right. This is what we're doing. We're enforcing our laws, our ideas. And yeah, that happened this past summer. So yeah, and these are some pictures of some old cavalry. It's just SUVs now, not horses. So that brings us to our last alleviation strategy, and that's just diminishing the impacts of actions, which could also be just not connecting the dots between a violent action and settler colonialism. So Lavender brought a lot of her stories very inward and talked about her identity as a lesbian in the area and just how violence against queer people, which is a product of colonization, has been just seen as like separate instances. So the murder of Matthew Shepard, Matthew Shepard is a white man, or was a white man, but that's still an act of homophobia, which has roots in colonization. People were in denial that that could even happen in a modern day, and that also kind of reminds me of the Patriot Front. People just treated it as they were the white supremacist group that came to Pride. People just treated it as like a one-time act that has nothing to do with consequences. But that all of that, specifically the murder of Matthew Shepard, caused Lavender to really need to do some introspection work. So that's when she really got involved in understanding whiteness and colonialism, and yeah, started doing trainings. And all of that started in 2000, and now she is in her 70s and really trying to unlearn these habits that she realized has caused her harm too. So altogether, to kind of answer these 2 questions, white settlers, we continue to cause violence, to commit violence, and then do things to make ourselves feel better about it. I didn't quite know. I knew we did that, but I didn't quite have these special categories. I don't think you really need special categories to talk about it, but it's predictable. And putting it on paper like that in categories can see that colonization, settler colonization, hasn't like drastically actually changed that much. It's just morphed. Um, and that allows this like continuous justification of violence, allows it to keep going and to keep us all in this system of harm where we're divided and we fight and that. And often these actions only receive minor backlash. Um, so I wrote on the back of your paper if you wanted to journal, because I do really hope that you can see yourself in this project. So I would love for you to think about what a liberated world could look like for you. And then also, what is your role in that liberated world or creating that liberated world? And how do your identities shape your role? I think we all have very specific roles. We all have very our own lived experiences that shape that, which is really exciting, because that means that we have agency and that we can do something. And then I wanted to end by uplifting work that's already being done. One thing that tends to happen in academic settings is just stating deficits, especially when working and doing research with Indigenous communities. But there's always resistance, and that's the amazing thing. So in Wyoming in particular, there's a lot of work to bring buffalo back, food reclamation, all as a means to combat these systems that be. And then also to just rebuild connection with each other and with and between communities. So the Wind River Tribal Buffalo Initiative, really important, that's very big. Or just the Intertribal Buffalo Council is really big here in Montana too. So Wind River Tribal Buffalo Initiative is essentially a chapter, I guess. So yeah, really encourage you all to look into these. And then in your own local communities, there's resistance, even if it's not super popular, it's always there. And for us white people in the room, I hope we can continue being active learners and active resistors. And yeah, just really grateful that you all came and did this with me. I know this wasn't easy, but thank you.